Okay, for this next step we're going to have to put dampers into the RotorHead. The kit comes with two types of dampers. These red ones, these are your beginners hovering, possibly some sport flying type dampers, and then the black ones here, these are the 3D dampers, which are a bit harder. So I'm going to be using these black ones, which will give a much crisper response on the RotorHead. But if you're hovering or doing, general flying around or sport flying, then you may want to use the red ones, as they will give you a slightly softer response on the head. Okay, so what I've laid out here are the various parts for building up the blade grips, not including the arm that goes on here, which is your control arm. So we're just building up the blade grip itself at the moment. We've got the usual thrust races here. We've got a spacer washer to go between the thrust race and the radial bearings, which are already installed inside the grip, so you can see those in there. And there's one in this side as well, and that spacer will go in there between that radial bearing and the thrust race. These are our feathering spindle bolts and the spacers that go with that. These are pretty chunky spacers. And then we've got our dampers, and these are the spacers that go just outside of the dampers, between the blade grip and the damper and the main head block itself. So those are the constituent parts, and of course the feathering spindle. Those are constituent parts, and we need to put those together. Obviously we need to grease up the thrust race, put some silicone grease in there, and we also need to make sure we install these thrust races the correct way round, so that the thrust race can function correctly within the blade grip. So I'll show you all that stuff next. Okay, so here we have the bits that we're going to need to put together our first thrust race onto the feathering spindle. And I'm going to do this outside of the blade grip so that you can see this very clearly, just as a dry fit. One of these thrust races will have a smaller hole in the middle than the other, and it's actually quite easy to see visually which one it is. This one here. When you put that onto the feathering spindle, you'll see that it's actually a very loose fit. You can see it moves around very easily, whereas the one with the smaller hole is a much tighter fit, and it doesn't move around as easily at all. The looser fit one goes on first, followed by the thrust race itself, with the open end of the thrust race towards the middle, and then the other thrust race goes on the end there like that to hold it in place. And then we have our screw with the washer, which goes on there like so. And we do that up, and that basically is it installed. It's like that, down into the blade grip like so, and that's it. That's properly installed bearings for your RotorHead. So we effectively need to copy that on the other side of the RotorHead once this has been inserted through the head block. So that's just a dry fit. Now you see the yellow stuff on the end here. What I did was I screwed this down into the feathering spindle, into the hole in the end of the feathering spindle, before putting the feathering spindle bolt in, and that was what was down inside the feathering spindle, which is effectively grease from when it was manufactured. So it's a good idea to try and get something down inside the feathering spindle there to clean the grease out, otherwise your Loctite won't hold, and you'll find that the feathering spindle bolt will back its way out. So try to give it a good clean out in there before you actually put the feathering spindle bolts in. So you can see that it's just sticking out a little bit. What I've done is I've put some silicone grease on these just to grease them up a little bit, and they literally just push into place like so. You can see that damper's now in there, and you can now take your blade grip with the feathering spindle inserted into it and push that through the head block. So it goes through the middle there like that. Okay, so there you can see the blade grip is in place with the little brass spacer in the middle there, and as you can see I've got my bolt in the end there to stop any grease getting off of the dampers into the end. and we can now install the blade grip on the other side using exactly the same procedure as we did for this side. Okay, and there we have the completed unit. You can see we've got our two brass spacers in there and our feathering spindle bolts installed either side, and these just need to be, done up nip tight. You don't need to go crazy on these. Just do them up, put some Loctite on them, and then just do them up. Just nip them up. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to put a Allen key either side and really wail on it with a a load of tension. The Loctite will hold it as long as you've cleaned out those threads. Just Loctite them and just knit them up, and it should be fine. Okay, so I have a number of items here now for the last parts of building up the rotor head. We've got the head button and the screw for putting that on, which will be the last bit that we do. These are the arms that go onto the blade grips, and they're bolted on with these 4 screws here. Just move those out of the way. These are the upper mixers, which are bolted on with these bolts here, and then we've got some balls and ball links and some spacers here to space these away from the grip arms. And also on the grip arms there are several holes that you can mount the mixer onto, and again, which holes you put the balls in on the mixer and which hole you bolt the mixer into is down to what settings you're following in the manual, and once again I'll be following the intermediate settings for those. So first step is to get these mixer arms and these blade grips arms fitted up and in place, and the balls all installed. So I'll do that first. Okay, so here we have the mixer with the balls installed. So if I just bring this up a little bit closer, you can see that the balls go to the inside edge where there is a larger piece sticking out than the outer side of the mixer. And then in terms of which holes I've gone into, you can see on the side where there are 2 holes in the mixer arm, I'm in the outer hole, and on the side where there are 3 holes, I'm in the middle hole, and that is the intermediate settings. So these now have to bolt onto the blade grips arms, which at this stage are not installed onto the blade grips themselves. And these install with the long screw and the spacer to space them away. So I'll put one of those, well, I'll put both of these onto their respective blade grip arms next, and you can see what those are like before I bolt the blade grip arms onto the blade grips themselves. Okay, so here we have the parts ready to be installed with the spacer and the screw in place. Now when you look at the blade grip arm itself, you'll notice that one side has got this kind of groove in it, and that's the side that actually locates onto the grip itself, and then the other side, that's the side that you are going to mount your mixer arm onto. So just be aware of that, and then you can see that these are set up so the screws that go in those are sort of nicely recessed and sit down flush within them. If you try and install them the wrong way round, you can see that they stick up, and it doesn't work. So they go in that side, and then the mixer bolts on to there, like so. So I'll go ahead and do that, and again use the intermediate settings. Okay, so there we have our 2 arms, mixer arms fitted to the blade grip arms, and you can see that I've gone into the centre hole on these, which is the intermediate settings, and these arms now need to bolt onto the blade grip itself. I've got a blade grip here, and you can see the 2 holes here. Okay, so here we have your standard Outrage paddle. It's a plastic paddle with a sticky piece over the cutouts that keep the paddle nice and light. You have 2 grub screws, and there's a little screw hole here that the grub screw goes. Just give you a look at that. See the hole there? The grub screw goes in there, and then you insert the fly bar in here, screw it on a good distance, and then tighten up the grub screw to hold it in place so it doesn't move in flight. Once you've made sure that those are, nicely lined up with the fly bar cage, so that when the fly bar cage is horizontal, the paddle is horizontal as well. So I'm going to install those onto the fly bar now, and the manual gives you a distance between this edge and the outer edge of the fly bar cage of 133 millimeters. You need to make sure that they are of equal length each side. So I'm now going to screw those on so that I've got a length of 133 millimeters. Do up the grub screw, and that's the whole rotor head completed. Something I just forgot to mention here, the Outrage paddles actually have 2 settings on them. There's 2 holes here that the fly bar can go into. If you go in the hole that's nearest the trailing edge of the paddle, so you can see the paddle here, it's this hole here nearest the trailing edge, that's for a faster response on your cyclics, and then the hole at the front, that's for a kind of a normal response on your cyclics. And following the intermediate settings, we're going to be going into this hole that is nearest the leading edge of the paddle. Okay, so there we have the paddle secured in place, and this gap here between that edge and the paddle is 133 millimeters. So between there and there is 133 millimeters, and exactly the same on the other side of the fly bar. Okay, here we have our linkage rods for finishing off the linkages on the rotor head. The smaller links here, which go on the upper mixer, they have a gap in the middle according to the manual on intermediate settings, this gap here of 3.5 millimeters. And this is the long link which goes down to the swash plate, and the gap here is 60.5 millimeters for the intermediate settings. So I'll install these onto the rotor head, and then we can see what the finished article looks like. Okay, so here we have our control arms installed onto the blade grip here, and you can also see I've now fitted the head button as well, now that these are orientated correctly, and they won't spin out of the correct orientation. You can see the other arm fitted this side. Make sure these are Loctited up tight, as I mentioned, so they can't move. And the last thing to do now is to fit the control rods onto these mixers, from this ball down to this one here, and also from the other ball down to the swash plate down here. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so there we have the completed item. We've got the all the control rods now fitted, as you can see. The double ball that's down here, you fit on the outer ball for that when you're using the intermediate settings, in order to get a nice run on that rod rather than the inner ball. Aside from that, there's really nothing complex about it. Everything is working as it should, and if I just move the swash plate here, you can see the head moving as it should. Everything installed, and I've also got the blade bolts in here just for safekeeping, so that they don't go missing or disappear. So that's the completed rotor head, and we can now move on to doing the side frames and building up the side frames.